Okay, good morning. So, it's always a delight to be with you all in Tullahoma, but it really says something that when you listen to our leader this morning, the background is a skull and crossbones, Katie's skull and crossbones with the red eyes. You don't get, it looks like it's pirate church, it's just, it's a very radical group of women and men. So it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm hoping in the time that we have that we can make this as much a conversation as possible. And the reason I say that is twofold. One, I'm going to be talking about something that isn't exactly my tradition, but something I think most of you have grown up with. And two, there's no answer to the issue I'm raising. So it's just going to be my opinion, and I'd love to hear, your opinions. I realize this is sort of an Easter talk, but the issue, it seems to me, is perennial. So I'm going to indulge a week after Easter Sunday to talk about the empty tomb that is at the heart of, was at the heart of last Sunday's church services around the world. So the empty tomb, or in fact, Easter itself raises all kinds of questions. The most common ones are, was Jesus an historical figure? Did he die on the cross? Who was responsible? Was the tomb empty? Was he resurrected? The first four questions, was he a real historical figure? Did he die on the cross? Who was responsible? And was the tomb empty? Those are questions that are questions for historians. You can do some deep dive into those things. For me, I think he was a historical figure. I think he did die on the cross. The Romans were responsible with, I think, an assist from the priests, the priestly class among the Jews. And I don't know if the tomb was empty. That I guess I'd have to leave up in the air. But the notion of resurrection, that's a question for theologians. And the interesting thing about theologians, as opposed to many other, I'm going to say thinkers, but I'm tempted to put thinkers in quotes. The difference is that theologians start with an answer, and then they search out the question. So it's something like Jeopardy, where the answer is Jesus is Lord, and what's the question? He was, was he resurrected? Well, yeah, because Jesus was Lord. But I'm neither a historian or a theologian. I am more or less, at least in the context of what we're talking about today, what is called in Judaism a darshan. You have the same word in Sanskrit. For a darshan in Sanskrit, I think, is when you go visit the guru. But a darshan is a noun is a title, more or less, in Judaism. It's one who tells and interprets stories. And for me, whether we're talking about the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament or any other Holy Scripture, but those two in particular, because they are so story-driven, I think they're stories. I think they're written by people. And I think that, as with many, if not most stories that people write, there's a message that they're trying to get across. Not necessarily the one that religion derives, but a message that they're trying to get across. And what I want to do is see if we can uncover that message, the message of the empty tomb. And the question I want to ask is, why did the tomb have to be empty? It had to be empty in order to do what the authors, probably the author, and then Mark was the first gospel, though not, you open your Bible, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but the first gospel to be written was Mark. Mark has an empty tomb, so everyone else has an empty tomb, and they all differ on details. But in any case, why make the tomb empty? And to get to the answer, I think you have to remember that these were Jewish authors writing to a largely Jewish audience, using largely Jewish themes. And that's why I'm talking about it. There's something about Judaism, even the Judaism of these of Jesus and the followers, the early followers of Jesus, that necessitates this emptiness. And to really get at what I'm talking about, we have to understand something about the name of God in Hebrew, something about the Ark of the Covenant, and something about the Holy of Holies, which was the heart of the temple of Jesus' time and before. So let me pick those up as briefly as I can. So, and I've talked about this before, not that you remember anything I say, I don't, but I've talked about it before. The Hebrew word for God is 4 consonants. In English, YHVH, in Hebrew, Yud He Vav He. It is literally ineffable. You can't articulate it. It's gibberish. It's not a noun, even though most English Bibles translate it as Lord. It's a verb. And it comes from the verb to be or to happen. So God isn't, or the Hebrew name for God, Yud He Vav He, YHVH, isn't really referring to a being, and certainly not to a supreme being, but to being itself. And in English, I don't even know how you write that. In Hebrew, it's the word is chayut, which means aliveness. God is the aliveness enlivening all life. But the name itself is unpronounceable. And then, so you have to ask the question, why would they pick a name that you can't say? And a lot of scholars, and I'm not one of them either, but I do follow them, a lot of scholars argue that this points to the essential iconoclasm of ancient Judaism. And I emphasize ancient, not necessarily later, but ancient Judaism. Iconoclasm meaning that they just had a visceral reaction against any kind of imagery when it came to the divine, and even not just images that you could carve, but even linguistic images. The word Lord gives rise to all kinds of imaging in your mind, but Yud He Vav He YHVH, it doesn't conjure anything. If anything, it's just like a placeholder. So you're reading along in the Bible, and every time the word comes up, you could really just, because you can't pronounce it, you would just stop. In fact, some of the Kabbalists, some of the mystics say that it's not exactly pronounceable, but it's breathable. That if you tried to just put breath behind YHVH or Yud He Vav He, you would get something like, something like that, from which the Germans derive the word Jehovah. Now they put vowels in, but some of the mystics said God is simply the breathing of the universe, something like that. And that's what the ancients, the theory is, that's what the ancients tried to get across with the use of this non-word, if you like. You know, it's the name, in a sense. It's like in Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, it's the Tao that can't be named. So this is the absolute reality or the ultimate reality, or just reality that can't be named, because the name itself is empty of the capacity to be vocalized. So God, the name itself, is empty. So just hold that thought for a second. In the story in the book of Exodus where God, now of course in the stories, God has all kinds of anthropomorphic, God talks, God has arms, God, it's all this stuff. But in the context of the story, God speaks to Moses and tells Moses to build an ark, into which, called the Ark of the Covenant. You've all seen the documentary Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark. So you know what it looks like, because they did a great job. The Bible is explicit about how to build it and what it looks like, and they modeled it beautifully in the movie. So it's just this big box. In the box was supposed to go, or maybe did, who knows, the box is lost. But in the box was supposed to go the 10 Commandments, both the original set of tablets, which Moses broke, and then the second set that Moses wrote later. So the rabbis make a whole big deal out about why keep the broken ones. And their idea is that the commandments are an exercise in trying to articulate what is fundamentally unarticulatable, and to remind you that the truth is beyond our verbalization. You put the broken tablets in to say, the whole, the complete, the whole, the intact tablets are pointed something that's really broken and you can't pronounce anymore if you ever could. So it's, again, another version of this ineffable YHVH name of God. But then the Bible says, after you've built the box, you put a cover on the box, and then you sculpt onto the cover, or attach onto the cover, 2 cherubs. So many of us are about the same age. When I was growing up in the 50s, my mother had bathroom wallpaper that featured cherubs. And they were these little chubby babies. They may be like, the angel with the arrow of love. What's that guy's name? I can't remember his name. But, they were just cute little bathroom cherubs. In the Bible, cherubs are fierce. They're these really, not demonic, but warrior kinds of characters. And there's 2 of them on the cover, standing on the cover of the Ark of the Covenant. And they're facing one another, according to the Bible. And their wings are also facing each other, but like aimed at each other. So the tips of the wings are facing, the tips of one cherub's wings are facing the tips of the other cherub's wings, but they don't touch. That's the key thing. They don't touch. So you have these big, fierce characters. Their wings are pointed at each other. And in this space that's created by the wings, it says in the Bible, God says to Moses, I will meet you in that empty space. And again, the commentators make a big deal out of why isn't God in the box, or why isn't God in the cherubs, or why does God meet Moses in the empty space between the cherubs' wings? And their answer is, like with the name, that God is without form, that God is nothing in particular, and therefore manifests only in emptiness. Now, if the Zen Buddhist group is still meeting, someone there ought to be going, oh, shunya, emptiness, no mind, all this stuff that Buddhism talks about. Well, I don't think it's a false equivalence. I think that, in fact, they're all, whether it's the authors and the commentators of the ancient Jewish texts or the Zen Buddhist commentators on emptiness, they're all coming from the same realization that at the heart of reality is an ineffable whatever. There's no language, right? Something ineffable. And the only way to talk about it is through language that tries to convey this ineffability. So it's shunya or shunyata, emptiness, or the YHVH, or the claim that God speaks you, out of the emptiness created by the angel's wings. The angels only provide you with a focal point to go beyond form. So the form is necessary in order to go beyond form. The third thing that I want to mention is the Holy of Holies. So the giant temple that Solomon built first and Herod rebuilt, and it was Herod's temple that was operative in Jesus' time. Both of them had this innermost space called the Holy of Holies. Only the high priest could go into that space, and the high priest could only go into it one day out of the year at Yom Kippur. And there's legends that the high priest would tie a rope around because it's always a male, tie a rope around his waist, and the priests who were serving him would hold the other end of the rope so that when he walked into the Holy of Holies, if he had to be rescued from being in there for whatever reason, they could pull him out. But in the Holy of Holies was nothing. Now, we know there was nothing. We have historical record of there being nothing from the Roman historian Tacitus Tacitus. And Tacitus, in his book Histories, talks about the fall of Jerusalem and how the Roman general, I don't know if you pronounce it Pompey or Pompey, something, but I think it's Pompey, but don't hold me to that. In any case, the Roman general, sort of to show the superiority of Rome over the Jewish rebels that had resisted Rome, had started a revolt against Roman rule, how they were so superior, he was going to go into the Holy of Holies where he assumed there was great treasure and come out with some and send the people in and take the rest of the treasure out. And they did take the treasures of the temple. But when he walks into the Holy of Holies, according to Tacitus, what he found, to his astonishment, was simply an empty room. There was absolutely nothing in it. And again, the commentators say, of course, God doesn't speak through form. God, especially in mystical terms, God is the aliveness of all life. So God, you could say that God is every form, but God, in and of God's own self, is formless. So it's like the Hindu analogy of the ocean and the wave. The ocean has no specific form, but the waves do. But the ocean can't be limited by the waves. The waves are nothing without the ocean, but the ocean is greater than the waves themselves. So it's the formless that takes precedent over the formed. So that's the Jewish background. So Mark being the first gospel writer, and the others riffing off his original story. Mark being Jewish, knowing he was writing for a Jewish audience, he couldn't go, the tomb that, and let's assume is historical, that Joseph of Arimathea said, hey, Jesus can use my tomb. I'm not using it yet. And he had the dead body of Jesus taken into the tomb. Let's assume that's history. Protestant Christians and all other Christians battle over where the tomb is located. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, and if you haven't, politics aside, because it's always, for me, very politically dicey to go there, but it's an interesting journey to make. And if you want me to lead one, I've done it before. I'd be happy to take you. But the Catholics and the Orthodox Christians believe that Jesus was crucified within what's called today the Old City of Jerusalem and was buried in not far from the place of crucifixion. And you can go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the cover story of this month's biblical archaeology magazine. It's a great article about the church itself. And you can go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You can climb up. Now it's a staircase to see where Jesus was crucified, supposedly, and then wander through the church, and they'll take you to what they think was the tomb where he was placed and then resurrected. The Protestants, especially the Anglican Church, has an alternative site. They don't say where he was crucified. I don't know if they argue with the Catholics about that, but they do say that he was buried in what's today called the Garden Tomb. And I've been to both. My sense is the Anglicans are correct about the burial place, because the description of it in the New Testament, though it's 2,000 years old, and a lot of the stone, the mountain that's there into which the tombs were carved, the mountain's been worn by just the elements for 2,000 years. You can still make out, I think, the description of that's in the New Testament. You can say, oh yeah, look, I see exactly what they were describing. This has got to be the mountain. These are probably the tombs. And then in the tomb itself, what's left are 3 tombs. And, there's a whole story about the rock being rolled away, and, it's a big miracle. But if you go to visit those tombs, you see it's not this surprising thing. The way they did tombs back then is they carved the hole into the mountainside. Then they cut or carved out, gouged out, I don't know what you call it, a trough in front of the tomb, on which they would place a big giant stone wheel, and you'd wheel it, just anyone, you could push it over the entrance to the tomb to keep the animals out. But if you wanted to go in, I don't know if one person could do it, but a couple of people could easily just roll it out of the way and have access to the tomb. So when the Bible says the rock had been rolled away, and we think of some kind of big boulder that no human could move, well, first of all, they put it over the entrance, so somebody moved it. It's not a miracle that it was moved. The whole tomb technology is designed to have a rolling stone, that's easily maneuverable. In any case, the tomb itself, regardless of which one you go see, the tomb itself had to be empty because it's Mark's story, right? So this is the story. It had to be empty in the story because the author of the story was a Jew writing to Jews about what was at that time a Jewish event. The Romans could care less. Nobody else knew about, there was no Christianity, right? So the intent was to continue a narrative that has its roots in ancient Jewish literature and then continues into what was then, 2,000 years ago, contemporary Jewish literature. Does that make sense? Because he's drawing from all kinds of biblical themes. And I mentioned the ones I mentioned, the three I mentioned. He's drawing upon those themes because his listeners, because he's not necessarily readers, but the people who would hear the story would get it immediately. They would be shocked if the tomb had some form in it, or even Jesus sitting there. It would just not fit the Jewish iconoclastic mindset that says, no, that whatever the divine is, or if you want, whoever the divine is, or whomever the divine is, it cannot take on a human form. So the tomb is empty because it's a Jewish story for a Jewish audience that needs emptiness at the heart of its theology. So I'm just going to wrap this up in a second and then open it up. I hope we'll have some conversation about this. So for Christians at Easter, I think the work of a Christian at Easter time is to affirm their faith in the empty tomb as proof that Jesus is the resurrected Christ. I mean, that's the proof. The tomb is empty. That's an affirmation of faith, because whether the tomb, you're not simply saying the tomb is empty, you're saying the tomb is empty, which means that he was resurrected, as opposed to having his body stolen, or as opposed to, I don't know if this is in, oh gosh, I guess his name just went out of my head, the guy who wrote Dan Brown, that this is just, Dan Brown's version where Jesus's body is stolen. And there are historians who would say, especially the people who wrote Holy Blood, Holy Grail, from which Dan Brown took his novel, who would say that, look, he wasn't killed. He was stabbed. They took him down early. Usually the Romans would leave the body up until the birds had eaten much of it. But they convinced the Romans to let the body come down for the Sabbath, which makes perfect sense in the context of the story, but no sense historically itself. So they took the body down because he was still alive. They got him to the tomb, they revived him, and then he escapes to France. So that's a little bit of a stretch, but a Christian can't go there, right? The Christian has to say the tomb is empty because Jesus was resurrected, not liberated and ushered out of the country. From the Jewish point of view, and I would argue not just Jewish, I would say for everyone else who identifies as something other than Christian, and I'm maybe inappropriately speaking for all of us, but speaking for myself anyway, someone who loves these stories as story, but who resides in a tradition that is really it's not Jewish, it's not Christian, it's not Muslim. It's much more universalist. It's perennial wisdom tradition, where all these stories are pointing at the same ultimate truth. For people like that, for people like myself, the work of Easter and the work of wrestling with the empty tomb in this story is to look at my life and to see where I have failed the iconoclastic test, where I have allowed form to dominate and blot out the emptiness which is at the heart. Now, I'm going to say one last thing about this, and hopefully not confuse the whole mess, but one of my favorite Buddhist texts is the Heart Sutra. And in the Heart Sutra, though I've just read a new scholarly translation that challenges what I'm going to say, up until last year when this new translation came out, everyone believed the Heart Sutra said something like this in English: form is emptiness, emptiness is form. There is no form, there is no emptiness, there is no form, there is no emptiness. It's just an attempt. The Heart Sutra is an attempt to clear away all of our philosophical notions to end up with a sense of shunya, of emptiness, and a grander scale. And I think that's really what the story, the work for a non-Christian is, to understand that emptiness continually gives rise to form because we're people and humans do that. And then our task as spiritual people is to continually deconstruct the form to reconnect with the emptiness. And if that doesn't make sense, you can ask me about it. I was talking with a Tibetan Buddhist just the other day about this, and there is a practice in Buddhism called deity, in Tibetan Buddhism, called deity yoga, where the monk will go off maybe for months at a time, live in a hut, food is brought, but no other human contact, and spends this time imagining a specific god or goddess and building that form up in the monk's imagination to the point where it is, I'm going to say tangible, but I don't know how literal I mean that to be, but it's so real that there's no longer any doubt in the monk's mind that this goddess or this god is present in their hut. And once that is completely real and not just believed in, but experienced as being present, then you spend the next weeks or months deconstructing it to show yourself how gods are created by the human imagination and how they can be dismantled by the human imagination. I think this is all the same thing. Easter time, the empty tomb, the empty Holy of Holies, the empty space between the cherub's wings, and the emptiness that is the name of God in the Hebrew Bible are all attempts to show us, to challenge us to deconstruct our image of the divine until we reach this empty space that is beyond any affirmation or, any speech at all. So I'm going to stop with that. I hope that was interesting, and I hope